Well, I'll talk to you a little bit now about the concentration camp. Concentration camps were established, they were established in England, Germany, Russia, China, Cambodia, and Yugoslavia. And in the Soviet Union, the estimates, these are estimates that were derived by Solzhenitsyn, were that 66 million people died in internal repression in the Soviet Union between 1919 and 1959. That's a figure that's 10 times as great as the figures that are commonly used to describe the genocide rate in the Holocaust, which was more like 6 million. And Solzhenitsyn also estimated, but no one knows, that 100 million people died in China during Mao's Cultural Revolution, when Mao decided that he was going to wipe out all of Chinese tradition and destroyed much of the ancient artifacts that characterized that tradition in a riotous catastrophe that lasted more than a decade. Solzhenitsyn says, the imagination and strength, spiritual strength of Shakespeare's evildoers stopped short at a dozen corpses because they had no ideology. Ideology. That's what gives evil doing its long sought justification and gives the evildoer the necessary steadfastness and determination. That's the social theory which helps to make his acts seem good instead of bad in his own eyes and others. This was how the agents of the Inquisition fortified their wills, by invoking Christianity. The conqueror of foreign lands by extolling the grandeur of their motherland. The colonizers by civilization. The Nazis by race. And the Jacobins, early and late, by equality, brotherhood, and the happiness of future generations. Without evildoers, there would have been no archipelago. The archipelago, the Gulag archipelago, is Solzhenitsyn's metaphor for the prison camps, like the prison camps that exist now in North Korea, in which millions of people are starving and dying, for the prison camps that littered the entire Soviet Union. And those cultures became so pathological that in East Germany, for example, before the wall fell down, and East Germany was arguably one of the more civilized parts of the Soviet state, 1 person out of 3 was a government informer. So if you have a family of 5 people, there's a reasonable probability that 2 of them are going to tell a government agent what you say and think. And that was also portrayed as the highest possible moral virtue, because it was much better for you to be an admirable citizen of the state than, say, a loyal daughter. And that's what children were taught in school, that the family was a defunct unit, and that individual relationships were secondary, and that all that mattered was adherence to the dogma that constituted the central axioms of the state. This is Solzhenitsyn's description of how communist ideological uniformity was enforced in the prison camps. An anonymous author is told how executions were carried out at Adak, a camp on the Pechora River. They would take the opposition members with their things out of the camp compound on a prisoner transport at night, and outside the compound stood the small house of the 3rd section. The condemned men were taken into a room one at a time, and there the camp guards sprang on them. Their mouths were stuffed with something soft, and their arms were bound with cords behind their backs. Then they were led out into the courtyard where harnessed carts were waiting. The bound prisoners were piled on the carts, from 5 to 7 at a time, and driven off to the Gorka, the camp cemetery. On arrival, they were tipped into big pits that had already been prepared and buried alive. Not out of brutality. No. It had been ascertained that when dragging and lifting them, it was much easier to cope with living people than with corpses. The work went on for many nights at Adak, and that is how the moral political unity of our party was achieved. If you have a rigid belief system, and that's what an ideology is, because its axioms are such that it encompasses all of reality, and then there are details left outside that don't seem to fit into that reality, well, then you ignore them. But what if they're embodied? What if they're people who are objecting to the way you think? Well, the equivalent to repressing evidence that runs contrary to your theory is the murder of people who object to what you say. And those two things are linked much tighter than you would think. You know, you might think, well, I would never do something like the communists did in the evangelization of my beliefs. But the truth of the matter is that in general, people will do such things if they're granted the opportunity and provided with the proper apparatus. This is Frankel from his accounts of the concentration camps under Nazi Germany. The most ghastly moment of the 24 hours of camp life was the awakening, when, at a still nocturnal hour, the 3 shrill blows of a whistle tore us pitilessly from our exhausted sleep and from the longings in our dreams. We then began the tussle with our wet shoes, into which we could scarcely force our feet, which were sore and swollen with edema. And then there were the usual moans and groans about petty troubles, such as the snapping of wires which replaced shoelaces. One morning I heard someone, whom I knew to be brave and dignified, cry like a child, because he finally had to go out to the snowy marching fields in his bare feet, as his shoes were too shrunken for him to wear. In those ghastly moments, I found a little bit of comfort, a small piece of bread, which I drew out of my pocket and munched with absorbed delight.